You're listening to the Yoga Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Land. This podcast brings you information and resources to enhance the therapeutic effects of your practice based on a deeper understanding of anatomy, physiology, and the integration of modern science and research with traditional practices and experiences. Join me and my co-hosts Tiffany Cruikshank and Katya Bach as we dive into all things yoga, research, and wellness. Hello, Rashmi. Thank you so much for making time to talk to us today. And hey, welcome back.
I'm so happy to be here. It's always fun. And I miss our yoga medicine community. And so it's always nice to connect.
It's kind of the next best thing, isn't it? At least it is for me. Nobody else gets the experience as often as I do, but I get every time to sit down and have a proper deep conversation with somebody like I would at lunch or dinner at a training.
Yes.
So you're right. It's precious.
Yeah.
So we're talking today about something called compassion fatigue. And this came up for me because I have an acquaintance who is a nurse in aged care and has been for decades. And she was telling a story about her work. One of her patients had passed away and she was dealing with the family and they were being very difficult. And she was reporting her feelings of inwardly being frustrated and kind of pulling her hair out going, come on, people, it's only death. And as somebody who has no experience with hospitals and has never worked with people who are unwell, I was shocked to my core. And it took me a little while to put myself in her shoes and think, not only is death something that she sees every single day and is the natural outcome of patients in her care, but she also sees things that are worse than death on a regular basis. And so just our perspectives were so different that she had perhaps lost sight of how the family might feel. And it really brought home to me that maybe as humans, we're not equipped to deal with really big feelings like this day in, day out for weeks, months, years, decades. And I figured that you were the perfect person to talk to from your perspective as somebody who practices yoga and meditation, but also somebody who works within the Western medical system in professional care.
Yeah. Rachel, and I noticed when you were telling the story, there's a point where you put your hand on your heart, and it was such a natural, because it feels heavy, so it's like that, you need that kind of grounding. But yeah, it's really these kind of stories are so natural in the caring professions, right? Because, in a lot of ways, as we see a lot of pain and suffering, it impacts us, right? So there's a word for that. It's like secondary trauma that we're sort of witnessing, and the stress from that we sort of carry, which, sometimes to some extent as a professional in the health professions, you're taught to kind of, be close and resonant, but a little detached, and so, but when does that detachment kind of lead to sort of cynicism or lack of empathy sometimes when that happens? And as you were speaking, it reminded me of my own kind of story of this when I was in residency, and I think it was like I was in the middle of like doing my floor rotations, and I was also just fatigued. My mom called me and was telling me about how my cousin's husband was diagnosed with colon cancer. And it was really interesting because my mind immediately went into like all these medical questions, like, and then about 10 minutes into the whole conversation, I was like, oh my gosh, like I never even asked my mom, like, how is she? Like,
how are they doing?
Like, what's going on? And it was like one of those, like, what is happening to me kind of moments where it was like, you kind of puts everything into perspective when you realize yourself detaching in that way, or, when it starts impacting your relationships at home as well, So there's a lot of things that are there in that process of caring that we don't always get training around when we're in the training for these professions either. Sometimes if we're fortunate, we do, if we're at some place that's really holistic and considers those things, but sometimes not.
Yeah, and it's a tough one because to some extent, if you're going to a medical professional or, or various professions we'll talk about later where it tends to come up is you do need some level of professional detachment. You can't have
Mhm,
them just crying with you through your diagnosis. You need
mhm,
somebody to be the guiding force in the room to be like,
mhm.
we're going to have a plan. Here's how we're going to attack this. So I imagine that there's some level of it that is not only natural but helpful, not just to
Mhm.
you as the professional, but to the person who's requiring your care. But how much is too much, and what's the right point of detachment? Yeah, I guess that's where
Yeah,
the rubber meets the
such
road.
important questions. I mean,
Hmm.
those are the questions of yoga, right?
Yeah.
So it's like
So maybe we start for people kind of
exactly.
framing it by what is compassion fatigue? We've hinted around it. How would you describe it to make it clear for people listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think something too we can talk about is what is compassion maybe first
Mm.
before we get to the
Okay.
fatigue part of it. Um, and when you think about compassion itself, um, it's that natural kind of um, caring nature within us, right? It's kind of this inexhaustible well of recognition and empathy that compels us to want to act in ways to sort of alleviate someone's suffering or our own
Mhm.
suffering when we see it. So it's this combination of the recognition of the empathy and then this action component. So it's more than just a feeling; it also
Mhm.
is love in action, right? And
Mm.
so um, and for any of you who have maybe practiced metta meditations or loving kindness practices from the Buddhist tradition, and you've probably sensed into that sort of vastness of compassion and what it can feel like. Even if you don't practice meditation, when you think of just the caring relationships and friendships that you have and that flow of natural care, kind of gladdens and opens the heart sometimes, doesn't it? Kind of feels so big. Um, but our relationship to that beautiful and inexhaustible compassion sort of shifts and changes as we meet the realities of what's unfolding, the real
Mhm.
complexities of life. And that relationship, that connection kind of, it gets constricted, it gets dampened, it feels heavy, as we kind of see and are impacted by, as I was mentioning, that secondary stress,
Mhm.
the traumatic stress of caring for others, in the face, as you mentioned, of your friend, the real heaviness of loss and grief, of death, as well as other kinds of sufferings that people, and then not only that, it's not only the interpersonal suffering, but also, the systemic things that
Yeah.
frustrate us that we know contributed to it, right? Like, so it's like the things like, oh, I can't get insurance coverage for this
Mhm.
patient that needs their diabetes medicine. Like, why isn't our insurance care better?
Yeah.
Or,
Plus, I've been working for 10 days straight and I'm covering for somebody else and I'm now 18 hours into my shift and
right. So the
all of
healthcare
those.
system itself,
Yes.
because there's
Mm.
real there's real system-wide things that impact things like burnout and compassion fatigue.
Mhm.
Those are real. Um, and those are things that can really kind of, get us down as well. And these systems are broken. So then that itself contributes to this kind of like moral injury, right? Because you are moral distress because you feel like you can't give the care that you want to give, or the things aren't in place to help you help this
Mhm.
person in the way that you want to. And so then that leads to things like, feeling like you're not making an impact, or kind of a
Mhm.
sense of low accomplishment, which then contributes to the cynicism and all those kinds
Mhm.
of things that
Mhm.
layer on top of each other. So in many ways, it's I mean, even as we're talking about it, perhaps those of you who are listening, you feel like it literally feels fatiguing, because
No, I
it
can
impacts.
definitely put myself in the shoes of the it shouldn't be this way. That sort of internal
Right,
friction of it shouldn't be this hard. I
right,
shouldn't have to fight like this.
right, right.
Ugh.
And so, and all of this just impacts our capacity to be present, like
Mm.
present with the people we're caring for and with ourselves, right? And
Mm.
so all of that just naturally kind of impacts then our levels of energy, and can lead to what we're talking about here of compassion fatigue, which is different from burnout. Burnout, when we're thinking about burnout as a syndrome, it's typically categorized as a workplace syndrome that can have components of compassion fatigue. So there's three main components of that. It's the emotional exhaustion, it's a sense of low self accomplishment in the job place, combined with kind of this depersonalization and cynicism. And it's usually very much related to sort of these system wide things that we're talking about. And so compassion fatigue can contribute to burnout. Burnout could lead to, compassion fatigue. But when we're talking about compassion fatigue, it's this real kind of emotional fatigue or distress that's kind of the cost of caring for others on a day-to-day basis. And so
Mm.
that could be formally as someone who professionally provides direct care to patients in a patient care setting.
Mhm.
And I think probably if you look at the academic literature around that, that's how it's defined, right? But I mean, this goes beyond that as well. You see it in informal caregivers like family,
Yes.
friends who are day in and day out caregivers for friends who might be going through something.
Mm.
And it can lead to kind of this sense of fatigue and exhaustion that's,
Mm.
could present itself with things like, physical symptoms like insomnia or
Mhm.
headaches, changes in digestion, irritable bowel, those kinds of things. But as
Mm.
well as, the cognitive and emotional kinds of things, like the kind of feeling of disconnection or a sense of overwhelm or hopelessness that, I'm not able to do what I want to do, or changes in the way that you express empathy, kind of like in the story that you talked about and that I
It's only
experienced.
death.
You notice, yeah, you
Mhm.
notice this, this change in the way that you might be present with somebody else. Um, and so one thing that, as we're talking about this, I want to make clear is that um, compassion fatigue is not a failure of somebody. It's not that we're not compassionate enough. That's not what we're saying here. And actually, it's probably those who are most compassionate and most empathic who are really feeling there with their patients who really
Mm.
suffer deeply. And so, even that word, compassion fatigue, like maybe that's not the right word, but that's what it's being called at the moment. So
Yeah.
we'll stick with that. But it's really, again, as I had mentioned, it's the fatigue that we feel from the realities of
Mm.
caring for others so passionately,
Mm.
um, and
Well,
it's
you've
something. Oh, I was just going to say it's something that when we notice it in ourselves, then becomes this thing we can kind of that allows us to kind of cue into ourselves and get a
yeah.
little bit more curious, right? So,
And that sort of leads into where we'll take the conversation of what can we do about it? Like if we
yeah,
have the mindfulness to notice that it's coming up, what actions can we take? But before we go there, you said a bunch of things there that I wanted to pull out a little bit. The
yeah,
first one
go
being
for it.
that compassion itself being vast and inexhaustible. And that
Mhm.
I think is a really important first point to underscore, because it's not, as you were saying, a failure of compassion. It's not a lack of compassion or an
Mhm.
insufficiency of compassion. Compassion is vast and endless. It's other stuff getting in the
Yeah,
way and kind of
correct.
interfering with that natural outflow, which is what
Yeah,
led you to talk about the similarities and differences with burnout, that you might have a Venn diagram where you have kind of workplace burnout and tiredness and frustration, but then you have this whole extra layer of somebody who is doing something that might almost feel like a calling, something that they feel is
right.
deeply important to do. It's not just my job. I'm helping people, I'm caring for people. That adds a whole different emotional and perhaps spiritual dimension to it. So not just burnout,
Absolutely.
although there might be some overlaps, but this
Yeah.
deep spiritual fatigue as well. The moral
Yeah.
outrage, you said it shouldn't be this way.
Right. And then I would add to that Venn diagram this, secondary traumatic stress that
Yes.
particularly, now after the pandemic, like
Mm.
that was just, it's almost too much pain to be with, you know?
Mhm.
And so the natural protective mechanism was to numb. Like
I
that's
just
just,
can't.
you
Yeah.
know, and that, as you mentioned before, like some of that detachment is necessary, and that really served people in the moment there during, during the intensity of the pandemic. But then what happens to that numbness? Does it stick with us? Are we able
Mhm.
to, change our relationship with it? So yeah, so that component of the traumatic stress and the moral injury, like you were talking about as well, they
Mhm.
all kind of play a part, play a part in this for sure.
Yeah, and
Um,
adding, as you were saying, to that feeling of having seen things or heard things, so many things over time that you kind of can't bear to hear anymore. And as you
right,
said, in most of the literature, it's healthcare professionals, nurses, perhaps first responders, or emergency workers. But you might also think about people working in humanitarian aid, or lawyers in those sort of settings, people in homeless shelters or women's shelters, or
yes.
any
Firefighter
places.
firefighters
Yes.
and
Yeah.
EMT, like all of that, right?
All of the things
All
that
of
as
those kind of
humans.
caring professions,
Mm,
teachers. I,
yes.
I've done some work with teachers and spent a lot of time with them, and there's so much there too.
Mm,
So yeah, it's definitely something that impacts a broader sphere of people
yeah.
other than just healthcare providers. But
Yeah.
yeah,
And then just to underscore the symptoms that we tend to see, or the signs that you might see to recognize it in yourself, or in somebody else. If you're thinking about the kind of physical bucket of symptoms, what sort of stuff would you see in people in terms of, you mentioned IBS or digestive challenges, anything else that might come up in people's physical state?
yeah, insomnia I had mentioned as
That's
well.
right.
Of course, shifts and changes in energy, chronic headaches, for
Mm.
example, that kind of stuff that you would see,
And
for
I'm
sure
really
in the
struck
clinical.
by those being such foundational aspects of physical health. Like if you're not getting
Yeah,
nutrition from your food, and you're not getting restored by sleep, how much worse is tomorrow going to be, and then the next day
right.
going to be, and then the next day going to be? You can see how that
And
would
then
be
it
a
gets
compounding
even
factor.
harder, too. You mentioned people who are in shift work. I mean, that
Hmm.
already adds stress, So you're correct if
Gosh.
we're not getting the rest, and yeah,
And then you also mentioned some physical and some mental symptoms of it. It might start off with some frustration, or some um, grief or guilt or anxiety, and it might build into this feeling of um, not being able to fulfill their purpose. Like,
right,
is it even worth me being here? Am I even making a difference? And that kind of
right,
bleeding into, what is it all for? Cynicism. Why even bother? That sort of,
exactly.
yeah, that arc of physical and emotional stuff.
Yeah, and I think the other big thing that's, quick to notice is just what was brought out, illuminated by your story and mine, that change in our ability to, um, be empathic to others, and when we notice it in the way we're interacting with others, I think that's another kind of cue into.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the key is, you, maybe because of your lifelong yoga and meditation practice, were able to notice that in yourself pretty quickly. Like, oh, I've gone straight into medical problem solving mode, and I didn't even stop to feel the feelings. How are they doing? How
Right.
are they handling it? And my friend, uh, perhaps doesn't have, or didn't have that kind of lifelong practice to draw on. I don't know when she'll get to the point of noticing that in herself. And so the question becomes, when you're in the midst of all of this, how do you then have the mindfulness and the kind of self study skills to go, oh my goodness, did you hear what I just said? Or I could just hear a track going on in my head of, why even bother? Oh my goodness, when did I start feeling that way? How can
Yeah.
we, I guess the first step is recognizing what's going on in the midst of
Yeah.
all of this pressure and workload and overwhelm and fatigue. How can we even tell if it's happening to us?
Yeah. I mean, I think what you're talking about right there is a big one, like,
Yeah.
building that relationship with ourselves and not just letting it pass by either, just really, inviting that curiosity to look inward, the
Mm,
curiosity as well as the self-compassion, right? Because when
mhm.
we notice that stuff, we're quick to blame ourselves and we're
I'm the
quick to
worst
go
human
down this
being in the
whole
world. Can you believe that yeah.
self-critical, or I'm not good enough, I shouldn't even be in this,
Yes. Especially when you
I
are
shouldn't be
someone
doing
who
this.
was drawn to that compassionate profession and you care so much that you've gotten to the point of the cup running empty, you can see how quickly you turn to, oh my God, I'm the worst person in the world. What am
Right,
I
and then you
doing?
add all the perfectionism and competitiveness that's there in some of these
Oh my
fields, and it's
goodness.
a mess, right? Um, and then, and to name sometimes when we notice this, we're quick to have a little bit of a dualistic mind and yeah, and then go to all the systemic issues as
Mm.
well as, well, that has to be fixed and that's the only way I'll be happy or my peers will be happy. Um, and of course, there's truth in that. Those systems
Yeah,
things like need to be fixed. Like
for
stuff
sure.
is broken. Like
But
healthcare
that's
in
not going
America,
to happen
in
today,
many
is it?
ways, that's
Yeah.
not going to happen. And we do our things along the way,
Mhm.
to help. But we don't have to let those things happen before we take care of ourselves either.
And I'm really
There
glad you
are
said
things we
that.
can do along the way.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out because, yes, healthcare systems and systems of all kinds, institutions of all kinds need to change for sure. But if we wait for that, we'll never feel better. We'll never be
Right.
helpful to the people who need our help. So, yeah, what can
And
we
I
do in the
think,
meantime?
well, and I think this is where those of us who are in healthcare healing professions one on one with individuals can really um, learn from those who do this work on a societal scale, like the
Mm,
social workers and community organizers and people who are working to help heal and transform at this group community population level. They know very clearly that it's hard work, and so there's a lot of just natural spiritual and heart care that they'll do themselves to help sustain them, um, not only when they're feeling stressed, but like along the way to
yes.
really sustain. And so that's where I think we can definitely learn from that and integrate some of that. You asked what to do, and I think I had mentioned that term self compassion as well. And
Hmm.
I think that's a big part of the equation is especially for those who are in caring professions, caring for others. We don't often we're giving so much. We give care very freely, and that feels wonderful. But we often don't maybe stop and let ourselves receive care either, whether that's from ourselves or leaning into the people around us who care for us too. We perhaps think that the circle of people who care for us is small, and we forget, how many people there are around us or how much we can help nurture that in ourselves. So, there's a lot of beautiful work around self compassion that has been done by Kristen Neff, who is a researcher out in California, and her colleague Chris Gerner. And they've sort of operationalized self compassion as having three key components.
Hmm.
The first being mindfulness. So, that quality of presence that you had mentioned. How do I even know, right? It's like
Hmm.
that presence, that quality of presence that kind of cues us in to help us kind of recognize that we're going through something right now, that this is suffering and experiencing something that feels heavy, right? And being able to hold it in context, so that kind of that perspective taking to be able to see it um, as we relate to it rather than letting it define us. So that's that kind of mindfulness piece. The
Mm.
second piece that they talk about is the remembrance of our common humanity, that kind of interconnectedness that we have with others, not only the interconnectedness through our spheres of influence, but through our shared experiences that, you know, there are many ways that all of us experience suffering in different kinds of ways. Um, and as well as the suffering that we share, and we also have these shared capacities for healing through that as well. So kind of that
Mm.
remembrance of the common humanity. And then the third piece is that piece of kindness that we can offer to ourselves, kind of the more explicit kind of kindness of offering ourselves friendship through whatever we're going through, kind of opening, as I said, to receiving care, receiving nourishment, being a little bit more explicit about that, and really nurturing our hearts. So those kind of three parts of it, um,
I love that.
I
And I
think
think
there's
maybe that third part might be difficult if you're somebody who's witnessing people who are objectively suffering a lot more than you are every
right,
day. It might be hard to say, I'm fine. Of course I'm fine, but right now I need help. And I don't need
right.
the same kind of help that these people need, and maybe I don't need as much of it, but right now I do need help, and that's okay.
Yeah,
I can imagine that
yeah.
maybe being difficult to do.
I mean, I think that's difficult for anyone, whether you're in a caring profession or not, right? So, um, but yeah, that and it's not something we're used to doing for ourselves. And
Mm,
so, um, as you think about these three components or making it a part of your practice, then
mm,
it's something that we can sort of ritualize into our day and offer ourselves more explicitly as well. And as I'm talking about it, we can think about this in terms of a self-compassionate, practice. But there's of course, like in everything in mindfulness and yoga, it's about putting it into context in our lives, as
mm.
well. So
Don't
there's
wait.
that too.
Don't wait for the crisis.
Right,
Yeah.
right,
And
right,
I'm hearing
exactly.
that come through in a lot of what you're saying is if you if you know you're in a position, whether that's professional or personal, where you are giving out a lot from that bottomless well of compassion, it's probably equally important that you set up some rituals to take care of your physical health, your mental reserves, your emotional and your spiritual state, to make sure that you're kind of topping yourself up every day so that
Yeah,
you aren't waiting for the crisis to go, oh my God, I,
yeah,
look at what's just happened. And it's to some extent natural that that would happen, but now I need to make changes. Probably a better idea to be doing the little and often if you can, to kind of set up those systems in advance.
yeah, absolutely. And as you think about rituals, as well, there's a lot of things that we can small things that we can do to help ourselves. So um, you had talked about, okay, recognizing that something's going on in myself.
Mm,
What do I do next? And that's the thing. It's like we often we're carrying a lot that feels heavy, whether that's the anger and frustration you had talked about around things that are happening, or the shame or guilt that we feel
mm,
about ourselves, and or just the
mm,
grief that we share from what we're watching our patients go through, our own grief, and grieving and grief is actually, in the research, it's a mediator between empathy and compassion fatigue. So,
mm,
we know that empathic concern is protective for burnout. And so, being in that flow of care and giving care is protective, around kind of those other things like the cynicism and all of that. Um, but the other parts of empathy is that you're really feeling with somebody. So when you're feeling that grief with them, the distress that comes along with that empathic concern,
mm,
can really kind of correlate then with that secondary traumatic stress that we talked about,
mhm.
and the compassion fatigue. So, but in a lot of health professions, there's no like structured way to kind of deal with the grief, right? Like, um, we were just kind of expected to go about our day, right? So,
Yeah, be compassionate
you're
by all
moving
means, but I'll need you here at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, bright eyed, bushy
right,
tailed.
right. So you're like
Yeah,
going on to your other patients, you're going home to your family, and
yeah.
you're not really acknowledging. And over time, that really weighs heavy on the heart and kind of can dampen that inner flame, or
Mm,
empty that cup. You used that term,
mm,
emptying cup. And then over time, then as we've been talking about the numbing, and all those things that can happen, the detachment. especially when that trauma is so intense. So, having a few ways through the day to kind of help um, just, release things that you're carrying can be really sort of helpful.
Mm. And what would
Kind
you
of
suggest?
yeah, I mean, I think so this is where there's so many beautiful things that are in our yoga and mindfulness traditions, right? That we can sort of lean into because it's full of ways to sort of recognize and work with and transmute our energy in sort of ways to help us keep letting go and finding freedom, right? So
Mm,
that's the name of the game. And so, it can be something even as simple as it's going to look different for all of us, but it could be something as simple as some breath work in between in the middle of the day, right? So
mm,
could be something vigorous like some bastrika pranayam or something more soothing. There's something that helps you kind of lean into that kind of quality of release.
mm,
Um, but it could also be something more meaningful, like lighting a candle, for example, at the end of the day, and just letting yourself, notice what's there, shine that light on what you're going through,
mm,
but also be able to release, release into the flame that you're witnessing, release into that flame of your heart, um, to kind of help yourself in a moment. And it doesn't have to be something you do individually. It could be something you do together, as well. And it can be really meaningful. I'll share an example. I was leading I've been, was leading mindfulness self care programming for cancer patients at Roswell Cancer Institute, which is in Buffalo, New York. And you might remember hearing, I know you're across the globe, but you might remember hearing last spring there was a horrible racial related gun violence shooting at a grocery store that happened there. And, we happened to have, of course, class that week. And, it was hitting so heavy on me, and I knew it would be on everyone else. So we had everyone bring a candle. And this is a class that I was teaching for patients and caregivers, so like family, informal caregivers of in the cancer community. And so everyone brought a candle, and we just lit the candle together and sat quietly with each other and allowed everyone the space to sort of talk about the grief and what they were holding. And it kind of just opened that space for everyone to sort of let go and be present. And eventually we got on to the topic of that day. But naming and being
mm,
with and
mhm.
creating that room to release is so important and
Yeah.
wonderful when you can do it together. Because as we know, going to yoga classes together with others or whatever it is, when you're in a group, there's that magic of the group, and we're social beings, right? So
Mhm,
being able to do that together can be beautiful. So maybe it's at a workplace creating an opportunity for that, like once a week or something at lunchtime,
mm.
lighting a candle and naming the names of people who have passed or people, or whatever that is that
Yeah.
kind of helps you, or naming the grief, naming the frustrating things of the
Yeah.
day,
No, I love that
that
because
kind
they're
of
such
helps.
simple suggestions, but so powerful because we do really as humans work in symbols and rituals, don't we, rather than kind of logical
Absolutely.
equations, most of us. And I love the fact that you've got a physical component of maybe making just a minute or 2 minutes or 5 minutes for some breath work, but there's also a psychological component of having the ritual of release, whatever that looks like in your home or in
Yeah.
your workplace. It could be something so simple that it just takes a minute, but you're acknowledging that you're feeling feelings, giving them space, giving them
Yeah.
a name, giving them an outlet if they want to take that outlet. And yeah, those things don't have to be huge and heavy, but just
It
finding
doesn't.
places to do them regularly. And I love the
Right.
suggestion of doing that in community, reminding you that you don't have to
Yes.
carry this alone.
To do it alone, right? And the pranayam, really, the exhale, what are we doing? We're releasing, right? And
Mm,
it's it's so important to cultivate that, not just as you're talking about psychologically, but even physiologically through
yeah.
us. But yeah, the being in community, remembering the way that we're connected to others is also
Mm,
a beautiful way to sort of help sustain us. Even, thinking about all the people who have done this work before us,
Mm,
or mentors who have been doing this and leaning into their care, whether they're alive or not, kind of
mm,
being in that stream of a lineage of caregivers, even that itself, and kind of releasing into that, those who have done this, before us can be another way, or even it could look like laying down in shavasana, right? And like letting go into Mother Earth. There was a beautiful practice that we did at a retreat that I attended last year with, it was an online retreat with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield, as well as Conda Mason and Devin Berry. And Devin Berry led a beautiful practice of just this, of sharing the burden with Mother Earth. She's the great mother, right? The oldest ancestor of ours that's here,
mm.
who has kind of been there and seen all of it. And, she can, letting her share the load with us, and, you know, acknowledging her even in that moment. We're acknowledging her existence, and that sort of allows for that connection in some kind of way to, nourish us in some sort of a way
Mm.
as well. So,
And maybe just a
um,
reminder that you're only doing what you can, and that's all that can ever be expected of you. You don't have
yes,
to share the burden.
correct.
You don't have to carry the burden alone. You're just doing what you
Alone,
can.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's a huge, huge reminder.
Mm,
Um, I'm trying to think of what else, but of course it'll look different for everybody, but
mm,
I think that's a great um inquiry, around that. Kristen and I've talked about that first step of mindfulness. Okay, so I've recognized this, and then inviting that svadhyaya and that self inquiry to kind of really look at, well, what am I holding on to? Like, what's making me heavy?
mm,
And what can I do to sort of honor it and help me release it in whatever kind of way that might be. So
mm.
that itself can be a practice, that can be sustaining in kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Beyond this too, I think another important part of it, of course, when we remember our interconnections with humanity, as we've been talking about, we remember, all the ways that we don't have to carry it alone, that sharing the burden part, that leaning
Mm,
into other people, even in the workplace,
mhm,
giving yourself permission to, delegate things, or, and kind of that, as we kind of also, as we're looking at ourselves in relationships, that piece of common humanity, kind of broadening our perspective out and seeing our interrelationships, then also remembering that quality of brahmacharya, in the exchange of energies, what are some boundaries that I can
mhm,
create for myself that sort of help me be able to sustain. And I think a lot of times when people think about compassion, they think about something that feels soft and ooey gooey.
but there's
And
a power to it too, right?
there's a power to that, but compassion can also be like fierce, and it can help us
Mhm,
do the hard things, right?
mhm.
Um, um, Kristen Neff talks about the yin and yang of compassion, but of course,
Yeah.
those teachings have always been there, about remembering that. So part of that kind of fierceness of our compassion is like having the courage to kind of do some of those things and set the boundaries that we need to, as
Mhm,
well as like the delegating, leaning into help, and receiving the help, letting ourselves
mhm.
receive that too. So that's another part of it.
I love that. And I think because there is an overlap, or there can be an overlap with regular burnout, you might also set into place some really basic physical self-care practices, like making sure that you're doing what you can to support good sleep, and making sure that you're doing what you can to support good nutrition, to eat regularly, to eat
Yeah,
foods that will sustain you, to have a movement practice that gives you an energetic outlet, as well as looking after your body, like all of those things. But because there's this added emotional, mental, spiritual component of it, that's really where we're focusing our energy today. And so you might have
yeah,
some daily self care practices that you do to make space to notice what is going on for me. What am I carrying today? Is there something that needs out? Is there something that I feel heavy with, that I want to try and share? Do I need help from people? Or is
correct.
today a day where I could offer help to people. So
Right,
having that kind
right.
of regular check-in being really key. And then
So
you also
key.
mentioned the importance of simple rituals, whether those are individual or communal, to
Yeah.
give outward form to the feelings
Yeah,
that
to
you
kind
need
of
to.
help process, and
Yeah.
not to forget as well, like therapy. Like, maybe the ritual is a weekly visit with your therapist, so
Yeah.
like all those things make a difference when we're thinking about creating that space for us to process.
Mhm.
It's a heavy load, so what are the ways to lighten that, which then lighten the heart in some kind of way and help us feel more buoyant and
Mm.
allow for that connection to really blossom. But so as we're talking about the connection and feeling more buoyant and all these kinds of things, you had mentioned that you used that word like filling and emptying your cup. And so, we're kind of in many ways, depleting ourselves, if we don't care for ourselves
Mm.
along the way. So, the nice reminder of that third part of the self-compassion, which is that like explicit kindness to ourselves, that these
Mm.
things we've already talked about are a kindness, but really letting yourself ask what will nourish me and giving yourself permission to sort of take that, I think, is really important, and particularly in these kinds of fields where you are witnessing a lot of suffering, giving yourself that permission to sort of nourish joy, because that's
Yes.
really important to help, and help that joy then naturally helps you reconnect with your meaning and purpose. You talked about how for some this is like very much feels like a spiritual calling in terms
Mm.
of helping. And so even just taking that time to reconnect every day with, what is my intention, like what draws me to this profession, what has impacted me around that a lot, is are some readings and things by a physician named Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen. Um, and she's a professor, I think out in California, but who from a young age was diagnosed with Crohn's disease. And so she had a unique experience of having been a lifelong patient and then becoming a physician. And that
Mm.
really shaped the way that she um, thought about her role, but then how she trained her students, other physicians. And so one of the big things that she talks about is, that when this does feel like a spiritual calling, to always remember and be nourished by that remembrance that we're serving others. We're not in the practice of fixing, or necessarily even curing.
Mhm. We
That
might
we're
just
here
be
to kind
walking
of,
alongside.
yes, we might
Yeah.
be walking alongside, doing what we can to alleviate the suffering. But a patient or the person we're caring for, their path is their path,
Mhm.
and so that itself kind of sort of helps me in any way to remember that I'm doing this in service of humanity, in service of each individual and the whole, not to fix people and be like the best doctor ever who cures everything and like all those
Super
kinds of
doctor.
things, right? So
Da-da-da-da-da.
yes. um,
Cape fluttering in
okay,
the wind.
right. So
Yes.
letting yourself sort of clarify your intention, but
Mm.
then also thinking about, as we're talking about this explicit joy, um, another really important thing is thinking about what is it about the actual day in and day out activities of caring that really bring you joy,
Mm.
that really nourish you. So there's now also a lot of um, talk in literature around what they're calling compassion satisfaction as
Mm.
being something that's protective against compassion fatigue for people in the healthcare professions. Uh, I kind of feel like that sounds like a corny sort of phrase, compassion satisfaction.
But what is it, the opportunities,
So
during your daily actions to be like, "Oh, I really
yeah.
enjoy this. I feel good about
Well,
this." That sort of.
yeah. Or like I like to think of it as savoring your caring, savoring
Mm.
the caring. So So, another thing to think about is, what is it about being in this act of caring that I really love and appreciate and feel nourished by? And letting that sort of be your grounding point through the day. And so
Mm,
then your practice becomes noticing it when it comes up, but not just noticing it, but um, letting yourself kind of savor that experience,
mm,
just for a few breaths, just like we do with, gratitude practices and this and that, just letting yourself savor that experience of
mhm,
joy can really be sustaining, and it doesn't have to necessarily be in the moment. It could be at the end of the day when you reflect back, right? So,
mhm.
or maybe you keep a journal where you just jot down what were those things that happened. It could be like, um, hearing somebody hum as they're doing their job, or interaction between a patient and their family, or flowers at the nurse's desk, or whatever it
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
letting yourself, um, yeah, savor your role in some kind of ways.
Mm. I
And
love
so
that.
all of that sort of helps to kind of nurture those kind of wholesome states of mind, right? The Chitta Prasadanam in Yoga Sutras, that kind of serene, compassionate clarity of your heart and mind that kind of helps you engage more fully. Because, um, yeah, when we're feeling depleted and empty, as we all know, it's really hard. Um, and so
And I
we're
guess
kind of cultivating that sort of, as we're filling that cup, we're kind of cultivating that. I often like to use this metaphor of a flame in a candle, or a
Mhm,
ghee lamp, right? And so
mhm,
it's like, that flame is kind of that flame of our presence, our awareness, the light of our wisdom that keeps us going, that helps us, with life. But that flame needs all the things, like it needs the vessel, it
mhm,
needs the ghee that's in there and the wick, it needs the air and the
mhm,
space around it. And so, like emptying or filling the cup, it's like when if that ghee is emptying out the bottom, or the flame is just burning so hot that it's like getting depleted, then, it contributes to this
yeah, I love that
feeling
visual.
that, and
And I think to
so,
me that really strikes me that we've offered, or, none from me, you have offered a wide range of things that we can do. And I guess as a person listening to this, I'd be thinking probably there are some of those that I'm already good at, but there'll be some that I'm not. I might be
yeah.
listening and going, oh, I never ask for help when I'm feeling that I'm carrying a heavy burden, or I'm never willing to accept kindness for myself, or I'm not good at noticing those joyful moments, those moments of
Mhm.
satisfaction. So, whatever kind of gaps you might have heard as the listener would probably be the place where I would start focusing my intentions. Like I already have reasonably good practices for this, and I've got a good outlet for that, but I'd never considered this side of the equation. And
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
is what I loved about that visual. Is it the vessel? Is it the wick? Is it the ghee? Is it the airflow? Kind of
Yeah.
looking for the place where you might be out of balance
Right. And
and bringing in
nurturing,
some practices. Yes.
and it's so, important to realize it'll look different for
Yes.
everybody.
Hmm.
And that's okay, but sort of just kind of thinking. And so, kind of to sum it up, so really thinking about those three things is the mindfulness of noticing that it's happening,
Hmm.
um, and the kind of perspective taking to understand now what this could be, the factors contributing to it, and then kind of, allowing yourself to get close and get curious and really look, what is it for me personally? What is this heaviness that I'm carrying, and how can I create things to let it go? How can I create boundaries that help me sustain? And how can I explicitly nourish the kindness and the joy, within me, to kind of keep this flowing and sustain us on the path, I guess.
I love that. I think that's a beautiful summation because all of those things really speak to the yogic pathway, don't they? Of it's like I always say in this podcast, I was looking for 3 easy steps, and lo and behold, they don't exist. It's it's a daily practice, isn't it, of noticing, of
Yeah.
understanding, creating wisdom and
Mhm.
discernment around, and then taking compassionate action in the place
Yeah,
that's the most relevant for you. That is
correct.
the yogic pathway to give you freedom from feeling that sort of crushing, overwhelming sense of there's so much to do and I'm not doing enough. So why even bother anymore?
Exactly, exactly.
Mm,
Because it can really it can really bring all of us down, can't it?
hmm.
So these are great, and I think the other thing too is the regularity of this, that
Yes, it's a
and
daily
it's not
practice.
just a one and done, right? And we had mentioned kind of this idea of rituals and ritualizing, and I think that's really important because it helps us, also just reconnect with the rhythmicity of life.
Hmm.
Our bodies, we are part of the ecology of life, like everything in nature has its rhythms and its patterns, like, you know, the spiral patterns on a shell, or it's spring here right now. So the way the dewdrops kind of accumulate on a petal, or sunrise and sunset, moon
Yes.
patterns, you can think of it. But like that, these regular rituals kind of add like rhythmicity to our day, to our weeks,
Mhm.
um, that kind of beautify uh, our lives and give us something we can sort of rest into. So I think that creating doing whatever it is you choose to do, doing it with intention, a bit of devoted effort, right?
Mm.
And I think a little bit can go a long way, as we always tend to say.
A little and often. I love that.
Yeah,
And we mentioned the systems. We're certainly not trying to paper over uh, systems that are broken or ineffective or inefficient. By all means, if you're activist
yeah,
minded, get out there and change the systems. But in the meantime, don't feel that
right,
you have to wait. There are things that you could
right,
be doing to take care of yourself in the
right.
meantime.
And a lot of people in healthcare fields are naturally already activists for their patients in some kinds
Hmm.
of ways and for the communities that they work in.
Hmm.
Um, so that doesn't have to stop. We can care, as we talked about, we can care in vast and expansive ways as long as we keep nourishing that connection to compassion within ourselves, nurturing ourselves, all these things along the way.
I love
Um,
that. I think
yeah,
that's so much for people to take in and chew on and digest, whether it is the kind of the fierce compassion side of setting up some boundaries, whether it is the joyful compassion side of finding some lightness to counter the heaviness, whether it is uh, introducing rituals, whether individual or communal, to kind of mark those rhythmic occurrences that remind us that we
yeah,
are part of the bigger cycle of life.
yeah,
All of
yeah.
those things I think are hugely helpful. So, any resources that you'd like to leave people with?
Yeah, actually, I wanted to share. I'm also part of a mindfulness collective, a collective of mindfulness professionals called Sustainable Caring.
Hmm.
Sustainable Caring was started by my friend who's also a psychiatrist and mindfulness teacher, Monisha Vasa, and her friend Casey Howe, who's a lead meditation teacher at Insight LA. And so they've kind of brought together this group, and we've been starting to provide different kinds of programming specifically for healthcare providers. So last fall, we did our first kind of virtual online summit or retreat for healthcare providers, and although that's finished, all of the videos of all the sessions are available online. So I'll provide a link for that. And
Fantastic.
and and with regard to that, we don't want cost to be a hindrance for anybody. So if you are a student or a trainee, or it was too much for you, there's an email there that you can, send a message to someone on the team and they'll help you out. But beyond that, also with sustainable caring, we're starting to roll out some regular programming to kind of create community for physicians and healthcare providers called Mended Cup. And then we're also doing these regular sort of, it's called gentle grieving, but sort of grief circles, like opportunities for us to create these rituals together, to meditate together, and just create space just to talk and share, to journal, those kinds of things together. So I'll make sure that I send you all the links with that. Those might be good resources to
Fantastic.
kind of explore. Yeah.
Fantastic. And you have already been a guest teacher on Yoga Medicine Online and are
Yes.
again in May. So if you just want to dip
Yes.
your toe into a kind of compassionate mindfulness practice, I feel like that's your absolute forte of that sort of
Aw,
gentle, spacious,
thanks, Rachel.
compassionate noticing. We will link to Rashmi's guest teacher page on Yoga Medicine Online as well for you to
Yes.
test
And
out
I
some
have some stuff
practices.
coming up this spring,
Mm.
that's based around nature, and they're all kind of feel good practices to help just settle it, using nature to settle into our own nature. And so
Mm.
you might find those nourishing too. There's a whole bunch of them. So,
Oh, I'm excited
um,
for that because that for me personally, when I walk up a mountain and sit at the top, that is when I have that perspective taking of where I
oh,
fit in that very, very big picture, and my
yeah,
small concerns become small concerns again a lot of the time.
yeah, because
Mm.
it's so easy to feel disconnected. So nourishing that connectedness is so important.
Oh, I love that. I'm excited for those practices. Thank you so much, Rashmi. Anything else you want to
Yeah.
leave us with today?
Um, I'm just so excited to be chatting with you, Rachel. Thank you for
Thank
inviting
you.
me. And as always, I look forward to future in person yoga medicine stuff to kind of practice and play together. And thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rashmi. Thanks for listening to Yoga Medicine. If you liked the show, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you got something out of this episode, please spread the word and share it with a friend. You can find more information, articles, trainings, and classes at yogamedicine.com. Check us out on social media as Yoga Medicine, or you can email us at info@yogamedicine.com. Thank you for being part of our Yoga Medicine community. The content of this podcast is not medical advice and is not meant to replace medical care. Please consult your healthcare provider to determine what is best for your unique healthcare needs.